Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at washingtech.com/book. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washingtech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washingtech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
A federal judge orders Apple to let the FBI crack a terrorist's iPhone. The FCC sets the forces in motion for set-top box competition, and Ron Busby joins me. A federal judge has ordered Apple to grant the FBI access to one of the San Bernardino shooter's iPhones. The FBI had requested access citing the All Writs Act, a law passed in 1789, granting the federal government the authority to, quote, issue all writs necessary or appropriate in aid of their respective jurisdictions and agreeable to the usages and principles of law, end quote. Recall that on December 2nd of last year, husband and wife Syed Rizwan Farouk and Tashfeen Malik walked into a San Bernardino Department of Public Health holiday party and opened fire on 22 people, killing 14. It was the deadliest shooting since Sandy Hook and the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil since September 11th. The FBI wants to disable the feature on all iPhones that wipes phones clean after 10 unsuccessful login attempts. This will let the FBI access phone data using its brute force method of running millions of password combinations. The FBI also wants to be able to enter the passwords remotely rather than having to have physical access to the phone and type them in. Apple is opposing the order, and the victims of the San Bernardino shootings are opposing Apple. Mark Zuckerberg has expressed support for Apple. For more information, you can check out Ellen Nakashima's reporting and commentary in the Washington Post, as well as Farhad Manjoo's commentary in the New York Times and Samantha Masanaga's work in the LA Times. The FCC held its annual meeting last week. It launched a much-anticipated proceeding to look at set-top box competition with proposed rules that would open competition for other set-top boxes to offer programming that currently you can only get with a cable subscription. The proposed rules would, quote, unlock the box to allow innovators to create competitive alternatives to set-top boxes. The agency also proposed a rule that would allow U.S. carriers to negotiate higher rates with Empresa de Telecomunicaciones de Cuba, S.A., Atexa, which is Cuba's state-owned telecommunications operator. In addition, the FCC issued a notice of inquiry into the state of independent and diverse programming on multi-channel video systems. The agency is seeking comment on various barriers encountered by diverse programmers and the effect of business practices, such as most favored nation clauses, whether over-the-top carriage, such as via Netflix or Apple TV, would be a more viable option for diverse programmers, and what more can be done to remove barriers for public educational and government programming. Lastly, the FCC amended the closed captioning of TV video programming rules to make it clear that video programmers are responsible for the quality of closed captions, with the technical aspect being the responsibility of distributors. The order also firms up complaint procedures and the certification process. The National Security Agency, NSA, declassified a report last week that seems to suggest, according to the New York Times, that the NSA is not collecting as much data from foreign targets as it was once thought. The Times notes that several advocacy groups have sued the NSA under a presumption that the agency has collected much more data from targets. But it turns out most of the data is just raw data from emails rather than wholesale searches of users' private data. Charlie Savage has more at the Times. Finally, I have some disappointing obituaries this week. Asil Moore has died at the age of 75. The Pulitzer Prize winner co-founded the National Association of Black Journalists and worked his way up from copy boy, as the New York Times calls it. He dedicated his career to improving diversity in journalism and the depiction of Black Americans in the news. Dan Brenner also passed away last week after being struck by a car crossing a street in Los Angeles. Previously, Brenner was the general counsel of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association and was a partner at the law firm of Hogan Lovells, among many other accomplishments. I personally knew Dan, and he was a great intellect, and many in the tech policy community, including me, will miss his wit and commitment to justice. He was 62. Stay with us. You guys are the best. And guess what? Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You'll be amazed at how much time Audible will save you. One of my favorite audiobooks of all time is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. That book is life-changing. Life-changing. You can order or stream The War of Art or another audiobook free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at washingtech.com/book. You're going to want to make time to stick around for the entire duration of my interview with Mr. Ron Busby. I have never on this podcast been blown away by someone's personal story as much as I was blown away by Ron's when we spoke. There are so many gems in this, so much actionable, useful, and inspiring information. I came away feeling like if there's anyone I want having my back, it's Ron, hands down. Ron Busby Sr. is the president and CEO of the U.S. Black Chambers, Inc., and a native of Oakland, California. He's also a successful business owner with significant experience in the small business arena. Recognized as one of the country's best CEOs, he grew his first business, USA Super Clean, from $150,000 in annual revenue to over $15 million per year. Ron graduated with honors from both Florida A&M and Clark Atlanta universities. He is a major advocate and promoter of education, especially the importance of higher learning. In his spare time, you can catch Ron golfing or spending time with his two sons. I actually met Ron at a conference a couple years ago. We were on a panel together, and I didn't really have another chance to connect with him until we did this interview. It took some time, but I finally got him here for you. Now, when you listen to this, you'll hear I was speechless after Ron told his personal story. And I said something that speechless people say, which I've since thought about. I said that we spend the early part of our careers being competitive and backbiting, and it's when we start families that we really know what it's all about. Of course, we stay competitive even after we have families. And of course, it's possible to know what life's about when we don't. What I really meant by that speechless gobbledygook, and it's much easier to add some context here than go back in and edit the interview. But what I was trying to say is that there is a human factor that many of us don't really consider when we are young. We have this invincibility. We just want to go off with both guns blazing, thinking we'll never die and we'll never get old. Then as we do get older, certainly as I've gotten older, you learn that you have to appreciate your family and friends while they're here. Don't wait till they're gone to start acting like a human being. I guess I'm saying all this because I lost my dad about a month ago. I didn't really know how to broach the issue or even if I should have broached the issue with you guys, but Ron's story hit me right between the eyes, and I hope you will be as inspired by it as I was. Without further ado, Ron Busby. The U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce is doing incredibly important work and creating so much value. So first of all, Ron, thank you for all the work that you and the Chamber do.
Thank you for having us on. We're looking forward to having great dialogue and hopefully coming up with some solutions as well as some tactics that your listeners can participate in to move our economic agenda forward.
And I want to start with you giving the audience a sense of your background because you yourself are a very successful entrepreneur. You're someone who reached a level of success where you could have just sat back and watched the dollar signs, but you decided that you weren't satisfied with that, and now you are one of the nation's leading advocates, if not the leading advocate for Black-owned businesses. So let's take a step way back and find out a little bit more about that aha moment when you realized that you wanted to be an entrepreneur, and then work our way up from there into where you are today and USBC's vision.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of tell my story. And I start most of my conversations off this way. Understanding my childhood, my mother is a minister. So I grew up with a spiritual background, knowing who my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is. But at the same time, I had a father who was also an entrepreneur as well as a Black Panther. So I grew up in a family where we understood both what was going on in our communities, and we also understood that through Black folk supporting Black folk, that is how our communities as well as our issues were going to be addressed. While I was a young man, I had the opportunity to work for my father. We had a small family-owned janitorial business, and I can remember at a very early and young age sitting with my dad on Saturday mornings doing payroll and ordering supplies and inventory and dealing with customer issues, paying taxes. So at a very young age, I understood the importance of being able to own your own business and have your own voice in your community. I also grew up in a community of Oakland, California, where most of the residents there were Black. And so we saw, from a family's perspective, from a young age, that when we worked together, that we would have a much better opportunity at moving our agenda forward. In Oakland, as you can recall, we didn't have the problems of many of our surrounding communities. We didn't have gangs. We didn't have Bloods and Crips. We had a community that really worked together to move our communities and our agendas forward. But at the same time, like so many communities, like Detroit, like Flint, like Chicago, we were based on, at the time, an industry of automobile manufacturing where my father worked at the General Motors plant, and he saw going forward what was happening in reference to automation and stepped out on his own to create a small business so that he could make sure that his family was going to always be taken care of. I had the opportunity to attend an HBCU, two HBCUs, Florida A&M undergrad and Clark Atlanta University. So once again, I was around other African Americans that were thinking progressively, trying to move our communities forward through both business as well as through corporate America. After college, I was able to work in corporate America extensively in Fortune 100 firms from IBM, Xerox, Exxon, and my last stint at Coca-Cola. And I remember as a 27-year-old young person going to work like many of us did, going in early, 2 hours earlier, so I'd always get to work at 7, and I wouldn't leave until 7 p.m. each evening. About 3 months into my career, my supervisor came in and asked me to move my things down the hall into one of my peers' offices. Is an older white guy, 56 years old, named Joe, and Joe was going to be moving into my office. And I asked my supervisor, I was like, well, what's going on? And they said nothing. Joe was going to now be reporting to me. A lot of my peers were getting excited about the opportunity that I was moving up in corporate America. That day, as you asked the question, I decided I needed to look for an extra strategy. I didn't want to be 56 years old, understanding and knowing where I was going, and have someone that would be willing to work a few hours more than me, younger than me, that I would ultimately be reporting to. And so at that, I started looking for an extra strategy to become an entrepreneur. And shortly thereafter, I went home to take over my family business, who at the time was still a very small business, a 5-man shop, doing an annualized revenue roughly $150,000 a year, which was not too much more than what I was making as a career executive at Coca-Cola at the time. A lot of my friends laughed at me and thought that I was crazy for going back home to the same bunk bed that I had when I was in the 3rd grade. But I had a vision to be able to grow this firm and double its annualized revenue each year, which was not that difficult from a small business perspective, to go from $150,000 to $300,000, to go from $300,000 to $750,000, and then from $750,000 to $1.5 million. I got involved in the SBA's 8A program, then became a $3 million firm through many of the programs that they had set up. Started growing nationally and ultimately got to a $7 million firm. I was in Oakland, California at the time. This was in the 80s, and realized that where the money really was in Silicon Valley, right down the street, about 45 minutes away in San Jose. I had been a corporate executive at both IBM and Xerox, so I understood technology, but I could not even get a meeting to discuss cleaning the buildings at some of the companies that I had worked before. If you think that the employment numbers are bad now, you can only imagine 20 or 30 years ago what the opportunities were like for not just African Americans, but minorities in general. It was dismal. But what I ended up doing in reading a book, and I know you're going to talk a little bit later about books that I have read, but I ended up reading a book by and about a gentleman by the name of Reginald Lewis, the first African-American billionaire, and it opened my eyes up to growth opportunities that I had never really envisioned at the time, and that was through an acquisition. And so I ended up buying my next firm and then grew my firm to about a $22 million firm. But I always knew that my calling was more than just being a business owner, that I also wanted to be involved in the movement of my community and black families across the country. I was dealt a terrible blow in 2009. My wife and I had been married. We had young sons, 5 years old and 6 years old, and she died right after I had left my third business venture. So I was in a new community with two boys, really no infrastructure to support us. And then 3 weeks later, I got diagnosed with cancer. So I was really down on all aspects of blessings, but understood, as my mother would tell me all the time, it's either going through the storm, just coming out the storm, or in the storm. And so all things do change, and got involved with my church, Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church in Phoenix, Arizona, and got involved with the Greater Phoenix Black Chamber of Commerce. And that's where I really decided, okay, this is my true calling. Became chairman of the board of the Greater Phoenix Black Chamber of Commerce, and then became president, and then later had the opportunity to start what's now known as the U.S. Black Chambers, Inc.
Wow, that's powerful, Ron. And, you know, when we're younger in our careers, we're just kind of getting out there and trying to make it happen. And, you know, even a little backbiting, and it's so competitive, and you don't realize what's coming down. You don't really realize what it's about until you start a family and you try to run a business when you have a family, and, you know, what all of those implications are. So that is just such an inspiring story. I really don't even know what to say right now.
Well, I'd say this. Most people have a story. All of us have some type of story, and many of us have overcome obstacles even greater than mine. I just say that I'm able to tell my story, and hopefully it inspires other individuals that are listening to know that they can continue to be successful even through the storm, because it's not going to be there always.
Wow. Just powerful. And, you know, that is probably one of the most powerful things we've heard on this podcast. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. Let's look at the statistics and the problems that USBC was created to address. The statistics are just staggering. You know, one U.S. Census Bureau report shows that Black-owned businesses have grown at triple the rate of new business startups overall. But at the same time, we're not seeing the same level of participation among African Americans in the tech sector, as you alluded to. What are some of the underlying reasons for that, and what is the USBC doing to address them?
Great question. In 2009, the U.S. Black Chamber was founded, and really founded it on 5 key pillars, as we called them. And the first one being advocacy. Coming here to Washington, D.C., I was really surprised when I was driving around D.C. If you read the back of our license plate, it reads taxation without representation. And that's ironic, because that's who black businesses have been for decades. We've been paying into a system. We've been believing in a system, even participating in a system that really doesn't represent our voices. We've had great, historically black civil rights organizations, NAACP, the National Urban League, National Action Network. We've had great organizations representing our civil rights, our rights of the ability to be able to vote, to be able to go to school, to be able to get an education, even to be able to get a job. But our business voice was being void. And so the U.S. Black Chamber has made sure that the first thing that we were going to be able to do is to make sure that our voices were heard when it came to policy, because policy really directs what happens more importantly than any other thing that happens in the country as policy. The second primary issue in reference to participation is access to capital. If you ask, and we just participated 2 years ago with the Wells Fargo Gallup poll, their survey for small business lending. If you ask all small business owners what their number one concern is, it will be access to capital. But if you ask black businesses, their number one, number two, as well as number three concerns, they will say access to capital. In 2014, the SBA made roughly 8.65% of all of their loans to black businesses. So when we were growing at the 60% rate, which you just mentioned, which was the fastest growing segment in the country, we were receiving about 8.5% of the loans. Fast forward 2015, same president, same administration, that number dropped to 1.9% of the loans being guaranteed to black firms. Not only that, but the average size loan that they guaranteed was $454,000. Now, statistics. In 2014, the average size black firm was $86,000 a year in annualized revenue. That means that all the receipts that they brought in, they were doing about $86,000. Fast forward 2014, the average size black firm's revenue was $72,000 a year. So we have firms that are doing less than $100,000 a year, and the SBA is saying that they want to make loans at $500,000. So even if we quadrupled our firm's revenue, we would not be a bankable loan for access to credit. 56% of all African Americans don't have a bank account. They're unbanked. So the U.S. Black Chamber is saying, how can we address access to capital through the programs that we have developed here? And so we do have access to capital programs through microloans, as well as through TILT programs and other partners that we've developed through black banks and through our microloan programs here to be able to provide the access to capital that our businesses need to start to grow and expand. The third one is entrepreneurial training. And so many of our businesses fail, not because they don't have contract opportunities, not because they don't have good banking relationship, but because they don't have the acumen to be able to grow and expand through all the turmoil that's going on. 90% of all businesses fail within the first year. We want to minimize that number by giving them the resources and the skills that they need to be able to have sustainability. And so, as I mentioned before, I graduated from 2 HBCUs, but more African Americans will graduate from the University of Phoenix this year than all the HBCUs combined because of their online access. And so the U.S. Black Chamber has partnered with the University of Phoenix to present an online business school that is geared specifically towards business owners that are African American, that are owned by African Americans, of 51% or more that have been in business at least 2 years, that are looking at the end of that period to be able to get a microloan. The next is contracting. And if you ask all business owners, they're all looking for that additional contract. And so we look at that really from 3 different vantage points. The government, and the government is now saying, yes, we've met our minority goals, true in fact, but that pot now is being separated in a lot of different business ethnic groups. The pot used to be primarily a minority group, which consisted of Asian, African American, and Hispanic business owners. But now you throw in women-owned businesses, you throw in disabled veterans, you throw in and include the gay and lesbian community. So the number that they reached was, yes, still 23%, but African American contractors received a smaller portion of those loans, and the dollar amount of those loans were smaller. We're also making sure that our corporate partners, we're holding them accountable for doing more business with black firms. And most important, what we're also doing is telling African Americans to spend money with African Americans. You know, a lot of people talk about the $1 trillion of spend that African Americans control each year, but the fact of the matter is most of that money is leaving our communities. And these numbers have been tossed around for decades. In the Asian community, their dollar stays there on average 28 days before it ever leaves. In the Hispanic community, their dollar stays there approximately 21 days. Our dollar leaves within the first 6 hours. So it's very, very difficult for our small businesses to grow when, in essence, we're boycotting our own businesses. We have to be able to increase the spend of minorities, particularly black Americans, with more black firms. If we could just increase that number from 3% that we're currently spending with black firms to 10%, we would be able to, and actually be mandated to hire 1 million additional new employees. Unemployment is the biggest concern that we have in our communities right now. In 2012, there were 1.9 million black-owned firms, and there were 1.9 million unemployed African Americans. Simple math says if each one of those firms can hire one additional employee, we won't have an unemployment conversation in our community. And so we're telling folk through the technology that we have on our mobile app. It's called the USBC mobile app. It can be downloaded for free on your Android or cell phone, iPhone, and it has 46,000 black-owned businesses there, GPS-driven. So now you can find those black firms in your communities in which you can spend money with. And then our last initiative is our chamber development, where we bring our chamber presidents and business leaders from across the country to Washington, D.C. each year. This year it will be May the 16th through the 20th, to give them the resources, provide best practices, as well as provide some funding for the local communities to be able to move forward as it relates to business opportunities.
And Ron, I want to now shift gears a little bit and talk about mindset with you for a moment, because quite frankly, it's something that I personally struggle with as an entrepreneur, and I know a lot of others who are listening do so as well. And it's this issue of having to basically be relentlessly optimistic all the time as an entrepreneur. It's this attitude that you can achieve your goals no matter what. But then there's that feeling of being blinded or blindsided by not being included in something, or feeling like when you listen to the gurus out there, well, maybe it's not so hard for them to be optimistic because they don't have to deal with all this other stuff. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that in your own experience? What do you think is the kind of the central principle, if there is one, that can, to some extent reconcile that need for optimism and the fact that, hey, there are some perceived forces out there. We'll go ahead and say they're perceived, but some perceived forces out there that really make us feel like we need to work infinitely harder than others in addition to just having optimism.
Well, let me tell you a story that my great-grandfather used to share with me all the time, and it's part of this perceived notion. In our community, you may have heard the old myth that white people's ice was colder than black people's ice. And we share that amongst our communities often. But understand that there's some truth to that. My great-grandfather, Daddy Ray, used to deliver ice on a truck. This was before there was refrigeration. And early Saturday mornings, he would get up and he would go and deliver the ice to his white clients first. Their ice would come off the top of the shelf, off his truck, and their ice would last 7 days. He would get to his black customers at the end of the day, at the end of his shift. And by the time he got there, the ice had been chipped down, melted down, and their ice lasted 5.5 days. So the fact of it is, there was some truth to the fact that white folk ice was colder than our ice. But based on technology there was today that was created by an African American that went to Howard University, we now have refrigeration. We have ice makers. And I tell my grandfather now, I said, because of this black man, I can get crushed ice, I can get cubed ice, I can get filtered water in my ice, and if I want to, I can get colored ice. we as a community need to understand that our ice is as cold as anyone's ice. Our products and our services are superior in many cases to anyone's product and services. We just have to make sure that we not only perceive it that way, but we believe it that way. And then the second piece is we need to be willing to pay full prices. Too often our businesses are having to discount their products and services to get the business. And when they don't, either our community says, well, I'll go somewhere else, or they provide them with the discount and not able to give them the quality of product that they really want to be able to deliver. And so our community say, well, I would go back and do that again, but, their ice wasn't as cold, or, the service wasn't as good. Well, if we commit to making sure that we're giving our companies the price that they need, I believe that we can provide the type of products and services that our clients and customers are looking for. So I think it is a perceived issue that we need to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but I think it really is a commitment from both of our policies. If the customer is committed to doing the right thing by our businesses, when there are challenges, tell them about it. If the service was inferior, tell them, but do one more step. Say, hey, I had an issue with this particular product or this particular service. If you can correct that, I'll come back next week, next month. And if it's corrected, I will bring you another client. I will bring you additional services. We have to start to make sure that we're supporting our own, to make sure that we have the ability to be able to hire additional folk to move our communities forward.
Ron, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and I just have a few final questions, and then we'll close. Sound like a plan?
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Well, this podcast focuses primarily on policy, but also the people behind the policy and what makes successful people tick. So I'd like to find out from you, Ron, what do you see as best practices? They can be apps, habits, daily routines. What keeps you on top of your game?
Great question. I believe this. There was a book that I read a long time ago that talked about each morning you need to get up and make sure you're saying, I love my job and I like myself. And if you can't do that at least 3 times a week, you need to start looking for another opportunity. Too often I get asked the question, well, hey, man, I want to go into business. What do you think I should do? And the typical answer is, well, go into something that you're passionate about, or go into something that you don't mind putting your own money into, or going to something that you don't mind working 18 hours a day. And I say that's crap, excuse my language. There are a lot of folk that have worked a lot of hours, put up a lot of their own money, and still went out of business. And it's not because they didn't work hard, not because it wasn't that they weren't smart, it's because they were in the wrong business. I tell young people all the time, unfortunately, for most of us, there aren't many new mousetraps. Technology is out here, and it's great. It's given us the opportunity to continue to be able to be creative and innovative. But most of the mousetraps have been created. So what I would tell people is if you have the greatest idea, find someone that's doing exactly what it is you do and go pick their brains. Either volunteer for them, work on side along with them, so that you'll learn their strengths as well as their weaknesses. And 2 things could possibly happen. Either you could buy that firm, they could continue to do joint ventures and partnerships with you in that firm, or ultimately, in worst case, you can become an employee. We want to make sure that we not only have more businesses, but we have sustainable businesses. And the way to be able to do that is to make sure that you have a vision board, so that each day, as business owners, we get up and we're fighting fires. We wake up and we say, well, what fire am I going to put out today? So I'm sure you've heard the concept of working on your business versus working in it. And the way that you can do that is to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of what your long-term goals are. As an employee, January the 2nd, you come to work and they tell you this is what our objectives are for the year. And these are what our objectives are for the quarter or the month or the week. We have to be the same and have the same amount of diligence when it comes to working on our businesses. Surround yourselves with good people, good experts, so that you can have clarity about successes and how to stay focused on getting there.
Yeah, and to your point about, how we perceive other businesses, for me, and one of the principles I live by and what I tell folks is that when you see another company doing what it is that you want to do, sure, they may already be doing it, but you can do it better. You can. That's the proof of concept right there. When you see somebody else doing it, that means there's a market for that, and nobody is doing it in your unique way. So that's definitely a point that resonates. But you mentioned a book earlier, and I wanted to get that from you. Because I always ask it for my guests for a game-changing book. So what was that book, Ron? And is that the book that you're basically recommending to everyone you meet, or is that just one of the books?
The name of the book is Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun? And it's a biography about Reginald Lewis and his ability and growth to becoming the first African-American billionaire. The reason why I think it's important reading is because many chances in today's environment, the small guy isn't going to really get the opportunity. The answers that we used to hear here in Washington, D.C., as well as around the country, is that I would love to do business with a black firm or your particular firm, but I can't find you. Now the new conversation is I'd love to be able to do business with a black firm or your firm, but you're too small. You don't have the size and the scale. We have to start to think about being able to go after large opportunities, and we're not going to get there organically through growing small businesses. Most of our businesses are not mom and pop, but they're mom or pop. Of the 2.6 million businesses that we operate, 2.5 million of them are mom and pop, don't have any employees. So what we have to do, the experts that are listening, is we really got to start thinking about how to get to size and scale, and we can get there through mergers, acquisitions, and joint ventures. And so this particular book talks about Reginald Lewis's journey to becoming that and how he got there through an acquisition.
Thanks again for joining me, Ron. And before we close, do you have any final thoughts for the audience, and where can we find you online?
My final thoughts are this. In order for there to be a strong America, you must have a strong Black America. And the only way we're going to have strong Black America is by having strong Black businesses. And the way that we create and have sustainable, strong Black businesses is through having strong Black chambers. And the way that we continue to have strong Black chambers is through you and your listeners. You can find out more information about the U.S. Black Chambers, what we're doing across the country as well as in your local community at usblackchambers.org. Again, usblackchambers.org.
And you've been listening to Ron Busby, President and CEO of the U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Busby, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
That concludes episode 27 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. I cannot do any of this without you, so thank you. And I'm on Snapchat, folks. Yes. So do me a favor and head over there. Add me at Joe Miller JD. I'm really starting to push Snapchat live video blogging because this thing is just going to explode in the next 1 to 2 years. Millions of college students are on there as we speak. And when they enter the workforce and start making purchase decisions, they're still going to be on Snapchat. And the only way you're going to reach them and incorporate them into your outreach strategy in a relevant way is if you start learning about it now. So I'm on there learning, and I hope to see you on there too. Send me a funny snap, and I'll send you back my facial expression when I see it. Thanks again, all of you, for listening. I'm learning.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.